You're not even welcome in this house anymore. Dad. Those words hit me like a baseball bat to the chest, right there in the middle of Maplewood Lane's little diner, the one I'd been coming to since before my daughter, Emily, was born. I could still smell the coffee, the faint tang of bacon, and the sweet hint of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven, but nothing could soften the sting of her voice. I sat there in stunned silence, clutching my cup of black coffee, watching her glare across the table. She didn't even flinch when her boyfriend, Tyler, smirked and added, "Maybe you should just skip Christmas this year. No one wants you there." I should have spoken. I should have stormed out. But instead, I just sat. The diner's bell jingling every time the door opened, each sound a reminder of how far we'd drifted. I've always been a quiet man. Born and raised in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, I worked at the local steel plant for over 30 years. I married Linda, my high school sweetheart, and together we built a modest life. Mortgage, bills, savings, a family we tried our best to protect from the harshness of the world. Emily was the pride of our lives, and I'd done everything to ensure she had more than I did growing up. But here I was, rejected by the very person I'd spent my life supporting. Before I continue, if you're new here, please like, comment, and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The story wasn't just about Christmas dinner. It was about years of sacrifices unnoticed. I'd co-signed her apartment lease when she couldn't qualify on her own. I'd helped pay for her car when the loan officer said no. I'd even covered her tuition for a semester at Iowa State when scholarships fell short. All the while, she seemed grateful. But lately, it felt like gratitude had turned to entitlement. That afternoon, I left the diner and drove past the old house on Elm Street. It wasn't fancy, just a two-story brick with a picket fence, but it was ours. I remembered the day we painted Emily's bedroom bright yellow, the laughter echoing through the halls. Memories of bedtime stories, scraped knees, and awkward teenage confessions swirled around me like ghosts. And yet, every memory carried the bitter aftertaste of betrayal. I parked in front of her apartment complex. The windows were decorated with garlands and lights, sparkling against the gray December sky. Tyler's truck was in the driveway. I saw them through the glass, Emily wearing a new designer sweater, sipping hot chocolate, laughing at something Tyler said. And I realized something. She was living a life built on comforts I'd provided, yet I wasn't welcome at the table. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. It wasn't just hurt I felt. It was a quiet, burning anger. Not the reckless, explosive kind, but the slow, steady kind that builds over years of being taken for granted. I drove home to my small apartment, a place filled with the scent of pine from the tiny Christmas tree I'd set up. I sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lights reflecting off the walls, and I began to make a plan. If Emily thought she could cut me out, if she believed Tyler's smug little smile meant they were untouchable, she hadn't met the kind of quiet storm I had become. Because money, like loyalty, can be invisible until it's wielded, and I was about to make my presence felt in a way they would never forget. I pulled out the stack of documents I'd been organizing for weeks. Bank statements, receipts, mortgage agreements, and a ledger of every payment I'd made toward Emily's lifestyle. Apartment, car, tuition, even holiday gifts. Each line was a testament to years of unnoticed support. I realized then that my revenge wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be angry. It would be calm, calculated, and public. Emily had underestimated her father, the quiet man in the background who had carried her entire world on his shoulders. I poured another cup of coffee and stared at the papers. This was going to be my Christmas present to her, and she would never see it coming. The bell over the door jingled again, but this time I didn't look up. My mind was already moving forward, each step carefully planned. I would take what they thought was untouchable and turn it into their shame. The storm was coming. The next morning, I drove to the bank, my bank, the one I'd been with since I opened my first account at 18. I met with Mr. Hargrove, the branch manager, a wiry man in his 60s with a perpetually furrowed brow. I explained my situation calmly, outlining Emily's apartment lease, her car loan, and the small line of credit I had co-signed to help her when she moved out. "You're telling me she banned you from Christmas dinner, but she's been living off accounts you've backed?" Mr. Hargrove asked, leaning back in his chair. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "Every payment, every bill, every little thing. She's been depending on me. And she doesn't even acknowledge it." He sighed, but there was a spark of understanding in his eyes. "Well, legally, you have leverage here. You're the co-signer on multiple accounts. If she defaults, or if you act, it could impact her credit." "It's not a threat. It's the law," I nodded. That was the beginning. The calm, measured beginning of what would be their reckoning. I wasn't going to humiliate them at the diner or on social media. No, this would be a lesson executed with precision. Later that week, I visited the apartment complex in Cedar Rapids, where Emily lived. The leasing office was tucked into the corner of the building. A modest room with cream walls and a receptionist who knew me by name after all these years. "I'm here to discuss the lease on apartment 2B, I said, handing over the necessary documents. "I co-signed it, and I need to understand the status of their payments." The leasing agent frowned, flipping through a folder. "Yes, Mr. Bennett, there have been some missed payments. The tenants have been contacted repeatedly." I smiled softly, as calm as the winter morning outside. "I see. Then perhaps it's time we revisit who is responsible for ensuring those payments continue." I left the office without another word, my mind already mapping out the next moves. Emily had always believed that because I loved her, I would forgive and forget. She hadn't understood that love and weakness are not the same thing. That evening, I received a call from the car dealership. Tyler had taken Emily's car in for routine maintenance, and the service manager mentioned that the payments were past due. I confirmed my standing as co-signer and, in my calmest tone, asked about the repercussions of non-payment. "You'd have to act fast, Mr. Bennett," the manager said. "Repossession could happen within days if no one covers the payments." A cold satisfaction settled over me. The pieces were falling into place. It wasn't about punishment. It was about recognition. Emily needed to understand that privileges without gratitude have consequences. A few days later, I stopped by the local diner again. It was the same one where she had spit the words, "You're not welcome here." I sat quietly at the counter, nursing my coffee and watching the snow begin to fall outside. Every detail mattered. The smell of the syrup, the clatter of plates, the murmur of patrons discussing their own holiday plans. And then, as if on cue, Emily and Tyler walked in, hand in hand, laughing. She didn't see me at first. She never looked up at the counter. But the moment her gaze caught mine, I could see it. The flicker of unease. The recognition that I wasn't invisible. Tyler tried to smirk, but the expression faltered. Emily's eyes widened slightly, and she whispered something I couldn't hear. It was working. I stayed calm, finished my coffee, and left without a word. No confrontation, no yelling, just the quiet presence of a father who refused to be ignored any longer. That night, I drafted letters to the apartment complex and the bank, copies meticulously filed, documenting every instance of missed payment, every past contribution I'd made, every obligation I had co-signed. The betrayal had been sharp, like a knife to the chest. But my revenge wouldn't be sharp and reckless. It would be slow, deliberate, and public. Emily thought she could erase me from her holiday, from her life. She had underestimated the quiet man who had built her world with his own hands, who had silently carried her through every misstep and mistake. The storm was no longer coming. It was already here. The morning after I finalized the letters, I sat at my kitchen table in Cedar Rapids, the winter sun casting a pale glow over my modest apartment. I went over my plan again, step by step, making sure each piece was in place. This wasn't about anger. It was about justice, about proving that being ignored didn't make me powerless. First, the apartment lease. I had alerted the leasing office to the missed payments and reminded them that, as co-signer, I had every right to enforce the lease. If they didn't act, the legal ramifications could be serious for Emily and Tyler. Then, the car loan. I had instructed the dealership to notify me directly of any delinquency, and I was prepared to step in or let it lapse. And finally, the holiday house, the rented cabin they had booked for Christmas with all the family, the lights, the decorations. Every deposit they'd paid was traced back to my credit card, a fact they assumed was invisible. I poured a cup of coffee and looked out at the snow-covered street. This was going to be quiet, subtle, but devastating. That afternoon, I met with my lawyer, Susan Caldwell, in her small downtown office. She was in her 40s, sharp, practical, and one of the few people who had always taken my side. "Emily and Tyler have been relying on you for years without acknowledgement," she said, reviewing the documents I had prepared. "This is not vindictive. It's enforceable. You have every right to make them recognize their obligations." I nodded. "I don't want to humiliate them in private. I want it to be public. I want them to see that taking me for granted has consequences." Susan smiled slightly. "We can do that. Notices to the apartment complex, the bank, the car dealership. We can even alert the cabin rental company. It'll be factual, calm, and legal. The shock will come from the realization, not from theatrics." It felt good to hear that, to know that my decades of quiet labor, the mortgage payments, the tuition, the car loans, had built leverage I could now use. Later that week, I began executing the plan. Letters were sent. Notices were filed. Every piece of paper meticulously logged. By Friday, the first calls came. The apartment manager informed me that Emily and Tyler had been notified of missed rent, and that legal action would proceed if no payment was made. The dealership confirmed the car payment was late, and the cabin company had contacted me, puzzled about the source of the booking. Everything traced back to me, the one they had tried to ignore. I didn't call Emily or Tyler. I didn't text. I simply let the system speak for me. By Saturday, word had begun to spread. A few neighbors mentioned seeing a flurry of activity at Emily's apartment, official-looking letters, managers asking questions. I could feel the tension rising, though I remained calm. My satisfaction wasn't in their panic. It was in the certainty that the truth was finally surfacing. Sunday morning, I drove past their apartment one more time. Emily was outside, fumbling with her coat, phone pressed to her ear, her expression a mix of shock and panic. Tyler paced behind her. I didn't stop, didn't call out. I simply watched from my car window as they confronted the consequences of their entitlement. And in that moment, I realized something else. This was more than just justice. It was closure, a recognition that I had always been here, even when they tried to erase me. That night, I sat by my own small Christmas tree. The lights glowed softly, reflecting off the ornaments. The scent of pine mingled with the faint aroma of leftover coffee. I didn't feel joy yet, but I felt something stronger. Control. I had been disregarded, mocked, and dismissed for years. Now, the reckoning had begun. The final step, I knew, would be the public confrontation. Emily and Tyler couldn't avoid it forever. The moment when the full weight of my presence, legal, financial, and undeniable, would hit them would be approaching, like the quiet snowstorm outside that builds into a blizzard. And I was ready. The phone rang. It was Susan. "They just called. They know you're behind everything. They're panicking." I smiled faintly, the first hint of satisfaction since Emily had shouted at me in the diner. "Good," I said. "Let's make sure they understand exactly who built the life they're trying to enjoy without gratitude." The storm wasn't coming. It had already arrived. And this time, They wouldn't be able to ignore it. The next day, the culmination of months of quiet preparation arrived. The family dinner at Emily's apartment. She had planned it with her friends and Tyler's family, assuming I would stay away, invisible as always. But I had other plans. I arrived early, parking a few blocks away. The snow crunched under my boots as I approached the building, a calm resolve settling over me. I carried nothing, no gifts, no confrontation, only the documents that represented years of sacrifices, unpaid recognition, and their cumulative entitlement. Inside, laughter and clinking dishes filled the air. Emily's friends were gathered, waiting for the feast she had promised, unaware that I had orchestrated the final act of truth. Tyler was adjusting the centerpiece, grinning smugly as though he had already won. I walked in quietly. Their laughter faltered, then froze. The color drained from Emily's face. Tyler's smirk dropped. "Dad?" Emily's voice was sharp, tinged with disbelief. "Yes," I said softly, my voice steady and calm. "I'm here." I held up the first envelope. The apartment lease, notices of overdue rent, every missed payment meticulously documented. Another envelope contained the car loan and correspondence with the dealership. And finally, a third held proof of the cabin reservation, booked with funds only I could authorize. I didn't yell. I didn't beg for recognition. I simply laid the envelopes on the table, one by one, letting the weight of evidence speak for me. Tyler's jaw tightened. What is this?" "Reality," I replied. "This is what happens when you assume someone who built your life for you is invisible." Emily looked around at the gathering, her friends whispering, eyes wide. I didn't. You didn't acknowledge, you didn't respect, and you didn't thank," I said quietly. "Every dollar I spent, every document I co-signed, every plan I made to ensure your comfort, all invisible to you. Until now." The room was silent, the only sound the crackling of the apartment heater. I could see the fear in Tyler's eyes, the shame on Emily's face, and the awkward glances of the guests, suddenly aware that the foundation of Emily's carefully curated life had been provided by me. I didn't leave. I didn't yell. I just sat, watching the unraveling. The tension was palpable. Emily's friends shifted uncomfortably. Tyler muttered something, but it was drowned out by the quiet authority I carried simply by existing in the room. Finally, Emily spoke, voice trembling. "Dad, we didn't know." "Exactly," I said, my tone soft but firm. "You didn't know because you chose not to see. And now, you do." The apartment manager and car dealership called Tyler minutes later, confirming their impending actions. Repossession notices, overdue rent warnings, and canceled cabin reservations. All facts, all undeniable, all directly connected to the man they tried to ignore. It was poetic justice. The villains of this story, the ones who laughed at my presence, dismissed my importance, and tried to erase me, were exposed for what they truly were. Emily finally slumped into a chair, hiding her face. Tyler muttered apologies, but it was hollow. The laughter, the smirks, the mockery, they had evaporated under the weight of undeniable truth. I stayed calm. I didn't gloat. I simply allowed the room to understand what they had ignored for so long. I was not invisible. I was not powerless. And now, finally, I was acknowledged. As I left the apartment that night, snow crunching beneath my boots, I felt a profound sense of peace. Emily and Tyler had learned their lesson quietly, publicly, and undeniably. The storm had passed, but the consequences lingered. A lesson etched in memory, financial reality, and dignity restored. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost serene. Emily and Tyler had retreated into their apartments, avoiding the neighbors who had now heard bits and pieces of the story. The whispers in Cedar Rapids had grown louder, but I no longer cared. I had done what needed to be done, not out of malice, but out of justice and dignity. I spent the morning sipping coffee by my window, the snow still blanketing the streets. The city felt smaller somehow, more intimate, as if my presence had carved a permanent place in its rhythm. Every letter sent, every payment enforced, every subtle move I'd made had led to a single truth. They could not dismiss me any longer. One afternoon, Susan Caldwell called. They're finally responding, but quietly. Tyler called the leasing office to negotiate a payment plan, and Emily's calling the bank. They're trying to fix the mess without making it public again. I smiled softly. Let them. It's not about pride, it's about recognition. They'll remember this every time they try to forget who provided for them. True, Susan said. And you look different, calmer, stronger. I chuckled. I've carried resentment for years. Now I've carried justice instead. It's lighter, in its own way. Christmas approached, and I watched from my apartment as the neighborhood lights twinkled on. Emily and Tyler's apartment glowed with decorations, laughter spilling faintly through the walls. I could see them now acknowledging the people who had quietly made all of this possible. Me. I didn't attend their gathering. I didn't need to. Their understanding, even if private and awkward, was enough. The greatest revenge isn't loud. It's undeniable. And it lasts. The cabin they had reserved? Cancelled. The car loan? Paid through oversight, but only after they realized the system would enforce itself. The apartment rent? Adjusted, after weeks of discomfort. And all of it pointed back to me. The man they thought they could ignore. The father they had mocked. The ex-husband they had underestimated. I walked through Cedar Rapids one cold morning, the scent of pine from the city's small parks, mingling with the crisp winter air. I passed the diner where Emily had once laughed at my worn coat, the grocery store where Tyler had scoffed at my choices. Each location now carried a different weight, not of vengeance but of acknowledgement. I existed in their reality, undeniable, respected, and unbroken. I paused by a small park bench and looked at the snow falling gently. It was quiet, peaceful, and untainted by anger. I had gained more than just justice. I had regained my dignity, my peace. Later that evening, I called Susan to thank her. It's over, I said softly. For now, she replied with a hint of a smile. But they'll remember. Every holiday, every bill, every conversation. You've made an impression that won't fade. Good, I said. They needed it. I sat by the window, the lights of the city reflecting in the snow. A single thought ran through my mind. Life is full of people who underestimate you, who mock you, who assume you're invisible. But when patience, strategy, and calm resolve combine, justice can be quiet, methodical, and devastatingly effective. And sometimes, the greatest gift isn't the money, the houses, or the recognition. It's the peace that comes from knowing you stood firm, with dignity intact, while the world around you scrambled to catch up. Emily and Tyler eventually came to terms with their mistakes, quietly repairing the relationships they had strained. They never apologized publicly, but that didn't matter. The lesson had been learned, the debt acknowledged, and my role in their lives recognized, finally and unassailably. As I settled back in my armchair, the warmth of the room wrapping around me, I realized that true victory is silent, enduring, and complete. The villains had lost their arrogance, and I had regained something far more valuable than revenge: peace, dignity, and the knowledge that I could never be erased. The snow continued to fall, soft and deliberate, covering Cedar Rapids in a blanket of quiet reflection. Life moved on, but this time, on my terms. Tell us your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories. The cold had melted, the storm had passed, and justice, quiet, patient, inevitable, had prevailed.